Three, two, one, here we go. Rainman's Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also, interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey everybody, it's the Rain Man. Today's episode is my thoughts on the climate change argument. But first, let me just say this. If you are part of Rain Man's Take community already, thank you very much. If you are new to the program, welcome. I know you're going to love the content. So if you could, go ahead and hit that subscribe button at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. That way you can help me with the YouTube algorithm. We can get this out to more people and continue the conversation going. So with that being said, let's get back to the topic of the day. So I recently went on a vacation with my wife to Peru. And during our time there, we visited Lake Titicaca in the high Andes. That's the highest navigable lake in the world and the largest in South America. Now, the lake is incredible. It's huge. It borders Peru and Bolivia and has some truly unique and interesting indigenous culture living there. In particular, the people of the Reed Islands. Now, that was a little bit of a tangent, but that was very wild to see. Why do I mention this, and what does it have to do with my feelings on the climate change issue based on what I saw at the lake? While on the way to Peru, I was shown an article from CNN. And now I'll just read it to you here. So the article is titled "The World's Highest Navigable Lake is Drying Out." It's by Jack Guy and Claudia Ribaza, and it's dated September 3rd, 2023. And again, this was from CNN. Now, if you guess that this article is going to be full of depressing pictures of dried lake beds and talk of increased droughts and other end-of-days opinions, then you would actually be correct. So I'm going to quote from the article here. "This is part of a gradual decline in water levels at the lake in recent years," said Flores. And a recent study which examined satellite images from 1992 to 2020 showed that Lake Titicaca is losing around 120 million metric tons of water per year, which the authors say is primarily due to changes in precipitation and runoff. So, sounds horrible, right? Well, we had lunch on one of the islands in the lake called Taquil Island, which was beautiful, by the way. Anyway, while we were there and we were hiking around the island, I noticed various sized walled agricultural plots along the shoreline and farmers working on those fields. Then I noticed several walled plots actually underwater just offshore. When I asked, our guide said that those plots have been underwater for more than 10 years. Now, what does that mean to me? It means that at one point, more than 10 years ago, the lake was lower than it is today, and for a period of time long enough for someone to build a walled section of their fields. So my question is, more than 10 years ago, when the rains came and the lake essentially flooded out coastal properties, what were people like CNN saying then? Now, did they say the rising lake levels are historic and due to changing climate? Can they have it both ways? I don't think they can. So I'm going to quote again from the same article. Quote, "The extreme altitude also exposes the lake to high levels of solar radiation, which enhances evaporation and constitutes most of its water losses." So does that mean the climate was cooler then and the effects of the sun less 10 years ago? Or is the lake just experiencing its normal fluctuation in water levels? I believe this fluctuation is normal. Some years it's more and some years it's less. In my view, man has had an imperceivable impact on the climatic changes that have been going on forever at Lake Titicaca and everywhere else on Earth. A similar example is this past winter rains in California. We had so much so that it should have filled our reservoirs and ended the drought. Yet, man-made policies will inevitably squander this abundance, a situation that I've actually discussed in one of my past episodes. So my take on climate change is this. Yes, it is changing, as it always has and always will. Even before modern man, there were cataclysmic climatic changes that even modern humans would have had zero control over if something like that were to happen again in our current epoch. So what is this climate change hysteria all about? My take has always been it's about power and control, pure and simple. And it's the usual suspects that are at it. I highly recommend you read the book Climate Gate by Brian Sussman. In it, he discusses the many scandals in the climate change hype, most notably the use of highly questionable actions when preparing the models and subsequent outcomes which have been used to justify many of the current environmental and green policies that you see in the world today. And the goal of these policies, in my mind, is to reduce the freedoms of people around the world and to gain control over all aspects of our lives. It's pseudoscience with very political ends. And that inevitably will make the world poorer and less free. But again, I think that that's been the point all along. That's where the control comes in. Just think of the World Economic Forum and what they want, which was described in their Agenda 2030. This is, in my view, what's behind it all. They, the elites, the Davos crowd, who I talk about quite a bit, don't want you owning personal property. And think of cars in this case, and are promoting the concept of the 15-minute cities. They have said this in the past. People will own nothing and they'll be happy about it. Now that should piss everybody off. It certainly does me. You can see the politics play out in real time. That's the reason no one from the climate change movement will call out China, by far the leading emitter of pollution in the world. If these people were really serious, and if we only had a decade or so to change our ways, as people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would have us believe, China would be enemy number one, and there would be serious sanctions and other deterrents set in place. The problem with that is you piss off China too much, and there goes the world economy. Depressions always lead to shooting wars, and this would be no different. Except today, the chances of cataclysmic outcomes is very real and very scary. Basically, to save the world, the powers that be would destroy the world. So I feel that they are not serious about this, and it's all politics. However, they need us citizens to believe they are trying to save the world so that they can continue with their power grab. They seek to shut down the conversation, all in the name of trying to convince us the science is settled, when in reality, it is nowhere near settled. So instead of healthy debate, the elites in politics and the media and academia resort to things like this. And I'll just read from this article real quick. It's from Zero Hedge, and the article's from September 20th of this year by Jonathan Turley, and it's titled, Former New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern urges United Nations to crack down on free speech as a weapon of war. Quoting the article, Jacinda Ardern may no longer be Prime Minister of New Zealand, but she was back at the United Nations continuing her call for international censorship. Ardern is now one of the leading anti-free speech figures in the world and continues to draw support from political and academic establishments. In her latest attack on free speech, Ardern declared free speech as a virtual weapon of war. In her speech, she notes that we cannot allow free speech to get in the way of fighting things like climate change. She notes that they cannot win the war on climate change if people do not believe them about the underlying problem. The solution is to silence those with opposing views. It is that simple. Can you believe it? Right out of her mouth. I feel like the politicians and their media allies are talking out of both sides of their mouths, publicly decrying the fossil fuel industry while having to deal with the realities of what that would do to their citizens, especially citizens in countries where they are still able to participate in the democratic process, where a politician's job actually depends on the votes and the will of the citizens. And read from another article here that I found very interesting. This article was from the website oilnews.com, and it was dated December 23rd. This is by Svetlana Paraskova, and it's titled UK Backtracks on Key Green Policies. I'm quoting the article here. The UK government announced this week a new approach to achieving the net zero 2050 target, softening some of the key policies as the cost of living crisis is at its worst in a generation and a general election is looming next year. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak delayed a ban on gasoline and diesel cars by 5 years and scrapped policies to force homeowners to make expensive energy efficiency upgrades. The UK's target to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 remains intact, but not at unacceptable costs for families, Sunak said in a speech at Downing Street. While the 2050 net zero target stays, some intermediate targets and some policies were either delayed or scrapped as UK residents and voters are trying to cope with a cost of living crisis with food and energy prices soaring, while Sunak's Conservative Party is trailing Labour in the polls by some 20 percentage points. Sunak said the UK needs to change the debate on how to achieve net zero from two extremes now to a more realistic debate. Obviously, these leftist politicians are really starting to feel the heat. And then there's this article that talks about the gorilla in the room that nobody wants to talk about. That it would do more damage to the earth to institute green energy changes than it would to not go green in the first place. This is right up there with the reality that the amount of mining required to get the amounts of lithium and other exotic minerals needed for EV batteries would do more damage and are more toxic to the environment than gas-powered engines. But again, nobody wants to talk about that because basically their argument would be over at that point. Anyway, there's an article about the children's toy Legos. Yes, they are made from petroleum byproducts, as is almost everything else in our modern world, which is another reality that you don't hear much about. Found this article very interesting. The article is from Zero Hedge by Tyler Durden, but it quotes a Financial Times article, and it's dated September 25th. It's titled, Toy Maker Lego Abandons Oil-Free Breakthrough Brick as ESG Push Derails. Quoting, woke toy maker Lego has discontinued its sustainability effort to manufacture bricks made from recycled plastic. This decision came after discovering recycled plastic was actually contributing to higher carbon emissions, the Financial Times reported on Sunday. In the early days, the belief was that it was easier to find this magical material or this new material that would solve the sustainability issue, Niels Christensen, the CEO of Lego, told Financial Times. That doesn't seem to be there. We tested hundreds and hundreds of materials. It's just not been possible to find a material like that. Financial Times points out Lego has instead decided to try to improve the carbon footprint over time of its oil-based ABS, which currently needs about 2 kilograms of petroleum to make 1 kilogram of plastic. Lego's sustainability goal to eliminate all petroleum-based plastics from its bricks by 2030 has hit a roadblock, and it raises questions about whether the toy maker knew that its ESG objectives were unattainable from the start. And then another classic article here. This was from Natural News by Ethan Huff, and this was on September 27th, just a couple days ago. And this one's titled, New $4 billion Panasonic electric vehicle battery factory in Kansas requires so much power that the facility will need its own coal plant to run. And I'm quoting from the article here. A coal-fired power plant in Kansas that was slated for closure will remain open after all to provide needed power for, wait for it, a new electric vehicle battery factory producing quote-unquote clean energy storage products. In accordance with the Biden regime's ongoing efforts to force all Americans into an electric vehicle, Panasonic has built a $4 billion EV battery factory in the small Kansas suburb of DeSoto. Local media reports state that the factory will require anywhere from 200 to 250 megawatts of electricity to function. This is roughly the amount of power needed to keep the lights on in a small city. On track to receive a whopping $6.8 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act, Panasonic is proving once again that in order to create clean energy, you have to burn a lot of dirty energy, rendering it a pointless endeavor. In other words, as increasingly more EV and other EV product factories get built across the U.S. to accommodate the Biden regime's green pipe dream, the environment will become more and more destroyed, which has left many environmentalists feeling betrayed as they recoil in fury. Testifying before federal lawmakers and members of the Federal Agency Regulatory Commission in Washington, D.C. recently was American Coal Council CEO Emily Athern, who spelled it out with clarity. Quoting her, "I met with senators and representatives who understand that we're going to need coal for far longer than people are talking about," Arthun said, explaining that the green energy industry requires massive amounts of dirty energy just to stay afloat. Thankfully, people are starting to wake up to the scam and the power grab. I just hope it's not too late. Almost to a person, the World Economic Forum, the UN, the Vatican, and all leftist political leaders are on board with the climate change narrative and are pushing green policies worldwide. My view is the end goal is control on a global level. But for this to happen, it means the developed world must be knocked down, which means technology and modern development and the first world lifestyles that we have enjoyed would be severely diminished. That is what is needed in order to bring in the world order the elites want, where sovereignty is no longer allowed. The U.S. leads the world, and as long as it remains strong, we can stop this movement. However, it's getting very difficult, as recent world meetings have shown. One example is Pope Francis's comments about the developed global North versus the developing global South. And the next article that I'm going to read from is summarizing a Zoom call between the Pope and Bill Clinton, who is currently going around the world with the previously defunct but now revised, completely corrupt Clinton Global Initiative. And this article is by John Angelillo from UPI, dated September 19th. And this one's titled, Pope Francis to Bill Clinton, "We must halt the ecological catastrophe of climate change." And I'm quoting the article here. Moreover, the Pope contended, predatory industries are depleting and polluting our freshwater sources through extreme practices such as fracking for oil and gas extraction, unchecked mega mining projects, and intensive animal farming. Moreover, richer nations have contracted an ecological debt that must be paid to poorer nations, he added. So basically, the developed global North must repay their debts to the underdeveloped global South, all in the name of protecting the environment and other climate change policies. And then there's this other article that I found as well. This is from the G77 plus China meeting recently that was held in Cuba. And the G77 is a group of 77 countries of the global South, and it was started in 1964 to articulate and promote their collective economic interests and enhance their joint negotiating capability. And that was according to the group's website. This article about this group I found on the Al Jazeera's website, and this was titled, "Global South Leaders Demand End of Plundering International Order." Quoting here, "After all this time that the North has organized the world according to its interests, it is now up to the South to change the rules of the game," said Cuban President Diaz-Canel at the opening of the G77 plus China summit in Havana. United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres joined 30 heads of state and governments from Africa, Asia, and Latin America at the two-day gathering. At the opening of the meeting on Friday, Guterres called for a world more representative and responsive to the needs of developing economies, stressing nations were trapped in a tangle of global crises. The conclusion is clear. The world is failing developing countries, is what Gutierrez said in Spanish at the meeting. The Latin American leaders that were in attendance here were Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Venezuela's Maduro, Colombia's Gustavo Petro, and Argentina's Alberto Fernandez, alongside Palestinian leader Mohammed Abbas, Angola's João Lourenço, and Mozambican President Filipe Nyusi. Many of those countries, by the way, have some of the most corrupt governments on earth. And that is just a sample size of the 77 developed countries involved. Pope Francis is literally trying to convince the world through his communications with the Clinton Global Initiative and George Soros' son, Alex Soros of the Open Societies Foundation, that we need to take money and influence from the developed global north and give it to the developing south, which consists of some of the most despicable and corrupt governments on earth. Oh, and by the way, right now, who is the country that is plundering many of the world's developing countries on the African and South African continents of their natural resources while propping up those corrupt regimes? Yeah, you guessed it, China, which is part of the global G77 plus China group. This is politics pure and simple and has nothing to do with saving the environment. Now, that's not going to make the developing world wealthier. It's only going to make the developed world weaker. And like I said earlier, I think that's been the main goal of all of this the whole time. All right, so let me finish by saying I am all for creating a better world. I recycle. I try not to waste water and electricity. I've said this before. I live by the Pacific Ocean, and I like my water and beaches to be clean. However, I am not willing to reduce my quality of life, all because some elites in politics or the media or academia told me that it's what is needed to save the planet. Quite honestly, I don't believe them. And the debate, in my view, is far from over. Okay, so that's it for now. I'll end it like I always do. If you're in the police departments, fire departments, first responders, and the military, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. This is the Rain Man, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.